Good morning and welcome to Rising on this chilly Friday morning in Washington, D.C. We have a great show for you today, and I am very happy to be joined at the desk by Stephen Kent. Welcome, Stephen. How are you doing?
Nice to be back. Washington, D.C. is keeping us real busy.
Certainly is. We have a lot to get to, so we won't waste any time in that. The Trump administration is continuing its mission of gutting the federal government.
The New York Times is reporting that the IRS is laying off nearly 7,000 employees. The White House is mainly targeting relatively recent hires.
Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said Trump is aiming to take things further, however. Take a look.
Well, think about it. Donald Trump announces the External Revenue Service, and his goal is very simple. His goal is to abolish the Internal Revenue Service and let all the outsiders pay. I mean, this is someone who is focused on America. Let's drive down our waste, fraud, and abuse.
The proposed External Revenue Service that you heard Lutnick refer to there would be used to collect revenues like tariffs from other nations.
There are around 100,000 IRS employees, and they consist of lawyers, accountants, and others. One of the emails employees got from the Times reads, under an executive order, IRS has been directed to terminate probationary employees who are not deemed critical to filing season. We don't have many details that we are permitted to share, but this is all tied to compliance with the executive order.
Democratic Senator Adam Schiff of California wrote on Blue Sky, Donald Trump firing about 7,000 IRS workers will mean three things. 1, more tax loopholes for the ultra-wealthy and big corporations. 2, more debt, since IRS agents collect a lot more than they cost. 3, fewer ways to go after big tax cheats. A great day to be a billionaire in America.
Political strategist Joey Manorino wrote on X, a Doge dividend would be nice. A tax holiday for 2024 would be nicer. Abolishing the IRS permanently would be the nicest.
Former Labour Secretary under President Clinton, Robert Reich, wrote on Blue Sky, for every $1 the IRS spends auditing the top 1%, it can collect $13. For every $1 the IRS spends auditing the top 0.1%, it can collect $26. Laying off 7,000 IRS employees during tax season isn't about efficiency. It's about making it easier for the rich to evade taxes. Headline yesterday, Doge visits the IRS. I think this is from Charlie Kirk by the looks of things. Headline today, IRS expected to lay off thousands starting next week. This is what an action-based administration looks like. Well, Stephen, I suspect we may have differing views on the desirability of laying off IRS workers. I would take the view that the function of the IRS is to collect taxes that are due. I know that nobody loves paying taxes. Yeah. I don't. I'm sure you don't. I'm sure no one else does. But I broadly share the views expressed there from some on the Liberal side of the equation that less IRS scrutiny and less IRS enforcement disproportionately favours the wealthy.
Well, I mean, I'm not so sure that that is the case. You know, I remember back in 2022, when the Biden administration and Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, Syracuse University published a pretty useful study that showed just how much the IRS ends up targeting, because it's easier to go through the taxes of poor people, folks who make less than $25,000 a year. If you want to run that through sort of the DEI and racial equity mindset, that ends up being blacks and Latinos predominantly. You know, this is a agency which of course has to collect taxes on every person who owes them, but it is easier to collect on people who make less money. So this talking point always gets kicked back and forth that it's letting the rich off the hook. Well, the rich already know how to get around taxes with every available loophole that is available. It's people who make less who never get away with it.
So I would, I guess, push back on that again, because during the phase that you're talking about, which was the Inflation Reduction Act and the debate about adding personnel to the IRS. 87,000, yeah, which was misconstrued in some quarters that the 87,000 were going to be armed agents or something, whereas in fact it was the total.
I recall that.
The total number of IRS employees. But the point is that at that time, the Treasury noted that the top 1% of earners account for 30% of the unpaid taxes that were properly due. And so the argument there, I think, is pretty plain, that if you have more agents, you have a greater capacity to go after those people, even if they have the economic means to hire accountants or hire people who are better able to try to bring down their tax bill. Of course, you know, at risk of stating the obvious, we have to differentiate between tax avoidance, which the rich are very able to pay for, and tax evasion, which we don't want anyone getting away with, and so that's obviously a problem. Just one final point, I know you want to get in here, but at that time, they were talking about the fact that high net worth individuals and corporations have approximately 4 million tax returns a year. And at that time, the IRS was only able to audit 7,500 of those 4 million. That seems to me a disproportionately low number, and one that we should certainly beef up.
No, I think that there's something to be said for that, but you know, we can always put this in perspective of how many IRS employees there have been historically for the past couple of decades. Something that a lot of people tend to miss is that the highest number of IRS employees before this time period that we're in was under the Ronald Reagan administration. There was a huge beef up of like 70,000 employees between 1982 and 1992. And Ronald Reagan passed a tax reform and a tax cut, but he also cut a deal to increase enforcement, to actually increase the amount of tax agents available to go after and collect every single penny on people. And then you see this broad decline from that 100,018 high point through the 2000s. And look, at the end of the day, we cut 15,000 IRS workers by the end of next week in the middle of tax season. It's bad PR, but we're just returning to Obama-era levels of tax enforcement agents. And I don't think anybody would ever say that there was some kind of financial tax collection crisis during Obama's presidency.
But the Reagan example, which I frankly wasn't aware of, is interesting, though, because that was obviously at a time when this great champion of conservatism believed that it was consistent with his views, albeit in tandem with a tax cut and tax reform, to beef up enforcement, which is basically my point.
Yep, you got to squeeze every dollar out to actually cover all your bills when you're a country that runs the deficits that we do. I respect that entirely, but you know, I just go back to 2022 and the IRA. The idea that the IRS needed to hire a couple tens of thousands more people to go after people for Venmo transactions of $600 or more. I knew you were expecting this. You know, the IRS specializes in going after the little guy. The fact that you sold your couch and made a couple $100 off of it on Venmo, that now you've got the IRS after you in a way that you never did before. The progressives always promise that things are going to target the wealthiest 1%, but that's really hard, and it never happens.
I shall give you the last word on that. Coming up on Rising, are there fissures beginning to appear in Trump Inc.? Stay with us. An interesting development in the media world, where some prominent conservative voices are opposing President Donald Trump's stance on the Ukraine-Russia war.
Trump called Zelensky a dictator this week, in part because he hasn't held any elections.
Trump also said that Zelensky had started the war. Here's political commentator Mark Levin on his radio show this week.
Zelensky ordered martial law. That's what the Constitution there compelled. Zelensky hasn't called for an election. That's what the Constitution there compels. Now, I'm waiting for the first free election for Vladimir Putin. I mean, this is almost comical in a sick way that Putin is demanding an election. Why is he demanding an election in Ukraine when he doesn't have free and real elections in his own country? And why does he get to call the shots when, in fact, he murders people who dare to challenge him? They didn't start this war. What were they supposed to do, roll over and play dead? 81% of the American people do not trust Putin because 81% of the American people are smart.
Fox host Brian Kilmeade and Senate Majority Leader John Thune also weighed in.
I believe that the Ukraine are the good guys in this. If they had their druthers, they would just be a westernized nation prospering the best they can with an imperfect democracy. It's Russia that is the problem. But what do you do with people in your own party that said, I'm done with this?
Well, I mean, I think there's that strong sentiment out there, and of course I hear it, and I think that frankly, I don't think there's any question about this. Putin and Russia are very clearly the aggressor in this conflict. That's just a fact.
Then, also as part of this trend, Fox Business host Maria Bartiromo and Republican Congressman Rich McCormick had a chat during her show this week. They voiced their thoughts on a potential Trump and Musk plan to give taxpayers dividends from Doge savings. Here they are.
I'm not real big on sending money back to the people in the form of checks. I'd much rather see the debt paid down because, quite frankly, when you send it back to the people, we're still building up a huge amount of debt, which we pay interest on. $1 trillion in debt interest payments per year. That's more than we spend on the military. We need to fix that.
Yeah, no, and we were just talking about this, Mark. I mean, to give money back to voters, it sounds nice and everything, but if our worry is debt and deficits, just send the money toward the debt and deficits. Let's clean things up.
Former Vice President Mike Pence and former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley had also slammed Trump over his Zelensky comments this week.
Independent journalist Glenn Greenwald wrote on X, "It's so dumb when establishment liberals feign shock that they agree with Mike Pence over something like Ukraine. The establishment wings of both parties agree on most foreign policy questions. Ukraine, China, Israel, NATO, etc. That's why the Cheneys campaigned for Kamala. The New York Post's cover today has a Ukrainian flag on the top corner." Federalist co-founder Sean Davis wrote on X, "So I guess the New York Post is doing the stupid Ukraine flag thing again. Kind of weird that we get this nonsense back the very moment the intellectual dork web neocons are all trying to gatekeep everyone to their right to keep the war going."
Lovely stuff. Dork web neocons is a phrase that we need more of, I think.
Ukraine flags. It's like we were in Alexandria.
Yeah.
You drive through Alexandria and it's just more Ukraine flags than U.S.
Little Kyiv over in Alexandria, over in northern Virginia. So look, I mean, we could get into the whole debate over the Ukraine war itself, but what I find more interesting about this story is these conservative commentators, very fervently conservative in some cases, displaying a willingness to be really quite critical of the Trump position. I mean, certainly Mark Levin there was really taking a very thinly veiled jab at some of the comments Trump had made. I mean, Levin noted that Zelensky's approval ratings were about 57% as opposed to the 4% that Trump had mentioned, but also making this argument, what were the Ukrainians supposed to do whenever Russia invaded? So there's a lot there.
There's definitely an old guard, new guard thing going on here in conservative media. On the old guard side, you certainly have Mark Levin, you have Glenn Beck, and I wonder where Rush Limbaugh would have fallen on this particular conflict. But Mark Levin represents that, I hate the communists of Russia perspective, which is we don't like Putin and the Russians. Not very surprising at all. And these are foreign policy conservatives who still stand by things like the war in Iraq, the Afghanistan invasion, and the war on terror. So that split exists. But what we're seeing here is the Tucker Carlson wing of the sort of new Republican and conservative movement versus, I would say, Ben Shapiro over at the Daily Wire, who's also one of the biggest voices, and he represents exactly what Mark Levin said as well, which is Putin is a thug. The Russian state is evil. They kill their dissidents without any discrimination, and Ukraine is doing exactly what they should do. But the line is drawn over how far the U.S. needs to go in support of Ukraine in getting every inch of their territory back. And I think Ben Shapiro has articulated this very well in saying the problem has been that we should support Ukraine, but also broker an agreement that ends this war, and Russia's going to keep that eastern flank of the country, because you can't get it back unless you give them jets and heavier armor.
Well, that may be the case, but I notice in Levin's comments, for example, he talks about Putin quite a lot in a way that is certainly implicitly critical of the Trump position, saying, for example, why does he, this is Putin, get to call the shots? Or that he, Levin, is still waiting for the first free election from Vladimir Putin. That is pretty clearly not Trump's position, because Trump has not really blamed Putin very much at all for having invaded a neighboring country. So I just think it's interesting because even though I completely take the point that there is this split in foreign policy terms, Levin, at least this time around, had endorsed Trump from very early on, I think early 2023, and is a generally very Trump supportive voice, as is Brian Kilmeade, for what it's worth, well, they're on Fox News Radio. So I find the willingness of these people to express their dissent interesting in itself.
I've operated in conservative and libertarian media my entire career. I don't find it surprising. There is a lot of diversity of thought on a lot of these issues, and there was a clip in there about Doge and check payments as well. You know, this is, again, a thing where populists and true conservatives vocally disagree on what is good policy, and they will call it out. The Republican Party is rambunctious. I know the Democrats have their own party, they have their own factions that like to make a lot of noise, but I don't think that's ever been comparative to the level of dysfunction and disagreement you see in a big tent party like the Republicans.
But isn't that in a sense blurring the line between the Republican Party and the conservative mainstream media, by which I'm primarily talking about
Donald
Fox
Trump
News.
Famously said, I'm not running to be the conservative nominee, I'm running to be the Republican nominee. He's not very conservative.
Right, exactly. And so there is all of those disputes within the more, I would say, intellectual.
You know, the Tucker Carlson line throughout this entire conflict has been to call Zelensky a dictator, which Mark Levin points out in his response here. Well, yeah, there are no elections during wartime. Their constitution allows for that. And just like history nerding here, you know, going back to the very earliest origins of the role of dictator in the Roman Empire, the idea, or actually republic, the idea was when the barbarians are at the gates, when invaders are at the borders of Rome, you dispense with democracy and you have one singular leader who finishes that war. Ukraine was invaded by a hostile power to the east. And you suspend elections and have that person ride out the war to its completion. The problem is nobody is trying to complete it. And the U.S. policy has been to elongate this war without giving Ukraine what it actually needs to be successful. That's got to stop.
I mean, I don't massively disagree with that point. I think myself and Robbie were talking about this yesterday. He's very opposed to the U.S. expenditure in the war. My point is there is a difficult choice either way. Either you cede the ground and let Putin win in a war of aggression with all the dangers that come with that in terms of Putin's role, in terms of America's prestige and influence, or you don't do that and you keep sending the money in the hope that attrition will work, and that's a long process.
It is, and nobody wants to reward Putin for hostile actions. Right. But we have to pick a position here, which is how much are we actually willing to put on the line to end this? I think Donald Trump is employing the strategy here, and I'm gonna call it a strategy of being the bad guy in this situation and saying, Zelensky, go back to your people and blame me.
But
say
not being the bad guy to Putin,
no, but to Zelensky. Zelensky needs an out. He needs the U.S. president, because they are practically a client state of the U.S., to say the U.S. president will no longer support us. We're going to have to take these losses on the eastern region of Ukraine. We have no other option. That gives Zelensky cover that he didn't have before. And Donald Trump, I think, is doing that in his own special, twisted way.
I think that is a generous interpretation, but we will, I'm sure, return to that topic on some other time. On to the topic of diversity. Is that a problem for the Democrats? How are they messaging it? More than that coming up now. Do Democrats have a problem with diversity messaging? Well, former Biden Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg seems to think so.
During a forum called The Future of the Democratic Party recently, political consultant David Axelrod asked Buttigieg about the spectacle that was the DNC chair election. Here's Buttigieg's response.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a little bit of that event you described, and it was a caricature of everything that is wrong with our ability both to cohere as a party and to reach to those who don't always agree with us. And we cannot go on like that. We cannot. I also think that we believe in the values that we care about for a reason. And this is not about abandoning those values. It's about making sure we're in touch with the first principles that animate them. What do we mean when we talk about diversity? Is it caring for people's different experiences and making sure no one's mistreated because of them, which I will always fight for? Or is it making people sit through a training that looks like something out of Portlandia, which I have also experienced, and it is how It is how Trump Republicans are made, if that comes to your workplace with the best of intentions, but doesn't actually get at what actually matters here, what's actually at stake. I think, and this might sound counterintuitive, if we were more serious about the actual values and not caught up in vocabularies and trying to cater to everybody only in terms of their particular slice of combinations of identities versus the shared project, I actually think if we thought about it a little bit differently, things like diversity would be actually an example of how we reach out beyond our traditional coalition.
MSNBC host Chris Hayes also weighed in on the issue earlier this month. Here he is on Real Time with Bill Maher.
I don't think there's anyone who hasn't had a moment across the political spectrum of some form of progressive communication that's either left them bewildered or a little like, I don't know about that. But I also think at the same time, there is a message of what I would call like common sense, patriotic pluralism. I think like fundamental parts of what we call in this country the traditions of pluralism, which is what this country is. And pluralism is another word for diversity. If we're not going to use that one, let's use pluralism. That fundamentally there's a majority that understands that like we all come from different places, and part of what makes this country work is we acknowledge and we negotiate those differences. And that's a thing that I think Democrats can win back a majority at message. I do.
So getting back to Pete Buttigieg, the AP reports that he is weighing whether he should run for Senate from Michigan or for the presidency itself.
Senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, Chris Rufo, wrote on X, Buttigieg is a cipher for the elite lib consensus, deletes the pronouns in his bio, adopts right-wing messaging on DEI. It's entirely cynical. He thought roads were racist, but a useful signal. Now is the time for the right to drive a wedge between elite libs and their DEI clients. Whew.
Oh, Christopher Rufo, with his Rufo-esque takes. I mean, the roads were racist argument is a mischaracterization of a completely valid argument, in my view, which is city planning and urban planning often cut off majority black neighborhoods from the broader cities within which they sat. But I guess that isn't the main topic in our...
Pete Buttigieg is savvy. He is most certainly pivoting. I do agree that this guy is angling for the Senate or the White House in the next 2 cycles. But he's right. I mean, when did we decide as a country to just overnight switch from referring to Asian voters as AAPI voters? This is not something that people connect with, but it just happened over the course of the Biden administration in the culture. And you could say that this sort of phase really began during the Trump presidency in 2017 onward as sort of the culture was backlashing against Donald Trump. But I really disagree with Chris Hayes that diversity is somehow unpopular as a word. I grew up in the 90s. Diversity never bothered anybody. It was sort of baked into the cake that, like he said, we're a country of people who come from all different places and have different beliefs. But the diversity of DEI was very much based on exclusion and trying to shame people who are part of majoritarian groups for being who they are.
Tell me more about what you mean by exclusion in that sense.
Well, I don't think anybody ever thought that in DEI seminars that inclusion was meant to have the, let's say, straight married white Christian guy feel comfortable in the meetings. It was never about them actually getting opportunities to still speak. It was based on, we assume that you talk too much and shout down your fellow employees of different backgrounds. It was never about having people come together. It was identifying people and going, you're a problem, you've spoken too much historically, no more of you. And voters know that, and that's exactly what Buttigieg is speaking to here.
Well, it is exactly what Buttigieg is speaking to, but more to the point, the debate that we're having right now is also what Buttigieg is speaking to, because Buttigieg said, what do we mean when we talk about diversity, and I thought it was a very good phrase about getting caught up in vocabularies. Yes. And I do think that there is validity to that argument and to making people feel sort of morally inferior if they don't say Latinx and say, you know, Latina or Latino instead, or things like that. But Buttigieg, in his remarks, made the differentiation between the values of essentially protecting people from discrimination and the separate issue of the trainings that you're talking about, which he rather amusingly described as like something out of Portlandia.
Yeah.
Now, the problem that I have often when DEI is discussed is that the criticism, particularly from the right, is always about, shall we say, the Portlandia wing, and never about the fact that there are, in fact, continuing structural inequalities in American life, and it would be to everyone's benefit, including the overall nation's economic benefit, if those were addressed. So, for example, unemployment rates between races, even when controlled for education, are still at significant variance. In 2023, for example, white people who did not complete high school had a 7.3 unemployment rate. Black people who did not complete high school was almost double that at 13.4%.
And why do you think
we
that
see?
is?
Well, I assume it is because there is a combination of basic underlying prejudice, and also because there is the legacy of white people in America having greater economic power, and therefore the networks that extend out from that, even at the lower income levels of employment, ultimately benefit white people.
This won't surprise you. This is a pretty boilerplate conservative position, but you know, AEI's most recent report on family structure and wealth and prosperity in America, that's the American Enterprise Institute, pointed out that the main drivers of success in this country economically are going to be when you have your first children, are you within a marital structure, or are you single and having children, and do you complete your education? And this breaks down everything. Republicans, I think, get a little bit too giddy to talk about this issue in racial terms, but there are plenty of black Republicans who will happily do it, say that there is a huge single parenthood problem in the black community and boys who don't know their fathers. These have generational downstream effects. Generational wealth and safety nets are best done in the family. And people fall behind when they don't do well in school, they get a poor education, and then they enter the workforce, they have a problem, right? They break their leg, they get disabled. Well, in maybe those families that came up in married households, let's say that they're white and upper income, that's their safety net. They get help. And it's not racist that they got help. They have families that are intact and that can help them. And that is less so in black communities.
But I don't think that the point that you are making disproves the point that I'm making as comprehensively as you think it does. For this reason, when you talk about things like single parenthood in black communities, there are reasons why those rates are higher, and they are not moral failings. They're because incarceration rates for black people were historically much higher than white people. They were because economic opportunity was significantly lower for black people, removing the capacity of usually the man, but not always, to be a sole breadwinner in a nuclear family. And so the erosion of what I think conservatives would call the traditional family in black communities itself has roots in racial inequalities and racial injustices.
I certainly agree with that to a certain extent. You and I have talked about the prison system on this show before, and it's indisputable. The amount of growth in the size of our incarceration system is so racially obvious, you have to ask questions about how we get to that point. But, you know, going back to Buttigieg and the comments about diversity, you know, I think it is telling that they still have appointed VP of the DNC, David Hogg, who was saying things in the past couple of years, such as gun control was a movement started by entirely black, brown, and indigenous LGBTQ women and non-binary people. What? Like, this is the problem, and I think this is what Buttigieg just wanted to put his head through a wall on. My problem is that I saw Buttigieg as Department of Transportation Secretary head, and he would have nodded right along with this when he was serving in the Biden administration. It's only that he is out of the administration that he's now going, guys, you made a mistake. This was a messaging failure. He went right along with it.
I mean, we're going to have to wrap, I'm being told, but I think that sometimes electoral defeats can be useful because they encourage people to basically change positions that were unpopular or to
That's right.
move
Shouldn't we have a system that like privileges popular positions? Democracy.
Next up, another hot topic, police accountability. Should it be measured? Stay with us.
President Trump is working to roll back some of the policing policies implemented following George Floyd's murder in May 2020. The president ordered the shutdown of the National Law Enforcement Accountability Database, a first-of-its-kind resource to track reports of misconduct by federal police officers across 90 separate agencies.
It was actually Trump himself who proposed this database back in 2020, but now he seems to have soured on the idea. Last month, he revoked the Biden-era executive order that commissioned the database. That order also restricted the use of chokeholds and no-knock entries, mandated body-worn cameras, and restricted the transfer and purchase of military equipment.
Trump's repeal of the order was welcomed by law enforcement, with the National Association of Police Organizations saying they had serious concerns about the database. The NAPO said it infringed on officers' rights and access to due process, and acted as a barrier to receive additional funding. So, was the database effective in preventing police misconduct?
That point is still unclear. While then President Biden signed the executive order commissioning the database in May of 2022, it was only launched in December of 2023. Experts say the database improved public safety by preventing bad officers from jumping to agency. According to a report from the Bureau of Justice Statistics this last December, it appeared that agencies were beginning to implement it as a routine part of the hiring process. Searches of the database trended up with time, with about 3,000 searches in August of 2024, compared to fewer than 500 just 6 months prior. Well, I'm curious actually about your views, because my views here are that obviously accountability for the police is a good thing, and I think that the greater transparency we have about the police record is a good thing. I think that any private company has HR records of its employees, and obviously those are not necessarily leading to, well, we hope they're not leading to criminal charges for anybody, but they are there to have a record of whether perhaps there are problematic elements in someone's record and all of that. I don't see a big difference between that and this kind of database. The reason I'm curious about your view is that you're, conservative but libertarian-minded, and as we mentioned in a previous segment, we have talked before about incarceration and things like that, where we find a surprising amount of common ground. So what's your view on all this?
Yeah, I will admit to being a little bit torn on this. On the one hand, I don't love the idea, the optics of removing a accountability database of police officers. Just looks really bad. It feels really bad. Why would we want to not have a database that tracks officers' individual infractions or reports by citizens? Because there is the problem of the wandering police officer, and this comes from a Yale study that was done a couple of years ago, around the time of George Floyd and the likes, that showed that there was this 3% of police officers who drifted from department to department, or left Miami and goes to Tampa, as an example, to be a cop there after they ran into problems in city number 1. So that looks bad. But on the other hand, and this sort of ties in with our IRS discussion, this was just implemented in 2023. The house is not going to burn down. This is not something like it has decades and decades of precedent, and we're going to be losing something with a historical legacy. This is open and shut of the book quite quickly before it even has an opportunity to make a big impact.
Well, I mean, that may be so, but if we think, and it seems like we do share the opinion that the underlying principle is a good thing, getting rid of something that is a good thing is still a bad thing, even if the good thing has only been in existence for a short period of time.
Yeah,
I mean, to sort of say, oh, well, it's only been around for a couple of years, so we can just get rid of it. I mean, that just doesn't seem to be, with all due respect, a particularly solid position to come to, because if we want these officers, their records to be known, and we want to be able to trace exactly the problem that you identify from that Yale study, obviously it would be better to have this than to wipe it out, no?
You could say that. I do think that, again, the optics of this are bad, but we also have another problem, and it's a huge political problem for Donald Trump, who, again, he signaled that he was open to this database at the end of his term in 2020, as the riots were kind of tearing across America and the Black Lives Matter movement was at full steam. He was the one who proposed this, but times have changed. The American voters have backlashed against this in a big way. Police departments are gutted in major cities, LA, New York, San Francisco. Resignations and early retirements are incredibly high, and this is not always true. Voters' perception of being unsafe and crime is not always accurate. But if voters are saying so loudly that they feel unsafe in their cities, you got to do something to make people want to be police officers again. And this is a signal to anyone who wants to be a cop, like, we're not trying to put you into some big blacklist database to track every single complaint against you that might be justified or unjustified.
I think you're getting into very shaky ground there. When you take the view that we have to make it more appealing to be police officers by removing a record of misconduct by police officers, I think you get into a very shady and shaky moral position, because you're really saying
federal record.
Right, but
it's not like you don't have a record if you commit misconduct.
Right, but the point of having the federal record is to address the very point that you yourself identified, which was people moving. They're not all going to be moving from Miami to Tampa. Sometimes they're going to be moving from Miami to Minneapolis, and therefore that's why there is the need for that kind of federal record.
A police officer breezes into town and is looking for a job, and turns out he was run out of Miami for acting poorly. This is a real issue, and the thing that I was part of advocating for after the George Floyd incident was the end of qualified immunity. And this is just police officers being able to get off scot-free and given immunity for infractions when they're performing the job. That, combined with body cams, I thought was the road to police reform. But the thing about George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement flaming out is that immediately went off the rails into just being incredibly unconstructive. Qualified immunity did not happen, and we just sort of had this heavy slap on the wrist for police officers with things like this, that the police officers union say violates their privacy, gives them no due process, and communicates from the Biden administration then to the police officers, we're suspicious of you. We don't think that you're heroes. We don't think that you're serving your community. We think poorly of you. And nobody wants to sign up for that.
I do think that there are a lot of dangers in going down the path of suggesting that because there is a public backlash against some extremists or some extreme actions, that we then loosen the safeguards against bad policing. George Floyd was murdered in the most brutal fashion, and thankfully the person who murdered him was convicted of that crime. It was captured on video, which is one of the reasons why it had the power that it has. There is obviously still a problem with policing. It is right that people who are problematic or overly punitive police officers get scrutinized for that, and where appropriate get sanctioned for that. And I think that this is helping that, and I think that it is part of Trump's overreach to say that we'll just clear that up and let it go.
You know, one of my thoughts on this, just sort of to cap this off, is that this was an executive action from Biden to implement this accountability database. And it was appealing to the ACLU and to Black Lives Matter. It was not appealing to the police union, and there were several civil rights organizations and a lot of libertarian criminal justice organizations who were also going, this order and this accountability database has a lot of holes in it. It either doesn't go too far enough in its mandates of information sharing between police departments, and by the way, it also violates due process. So there were both parties from the left and right going, this could have been better, which is why things like this should go through Congress. There should actually be legislation that lays out the law and gives both interest groups an opportunity to come and lobby in Washington, D.C. and make a better bill and a better law.
Yes, but let me just, we have to finish this off here, but let me just emphasize, it isn't always just a battle between interest groups. There are actually bigger principles of fairness and accountability at stake. And so whether it pleases the ACLU or the police union, fine. That is tangential to the real point of having a police system that people can have faith will certainly do policing, but do it in an equitable way to all the people of this country.
I'll let you have it.
On that topic, the administration has put out a most interesting video on deportations. There's a little teaser for you. It's coming up next. Stay with us. ASMR, if you didn't know, stands for Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response. That's better known as a tingling sensation that can be triggered by audio and visual stimuli. It's also often described as a pleasant feeling.
This is the White House's version, which it posted this week on X. It's called ASMR, Illegal Alien Deportation Flight. Let's take a look.
let that sink in, I guess. Whatever. Tesla CEO Elon Musk reposted this video on X, writing, haha, wow. And the anti-Trump Lincoln Project wrote on X, if Hitler had a social media account. Well, where to go with this? I mean, I'm not sure the Hitler comparison is great, but the official White House account posting a video of people being chained and having sort of shackles on the ground as something that would provoke a pleasant response, that seems completely gross and outrageous and awful to me. There is a separate argument to be made about illegal immigration. We have had versions of that argument on this show lots of times, but to be presenting an image of people in chains as something that should create a pleasant response or a gleeful response, I just think is appalling.
Yeah, I would say crude and jarring for White House formal communications. You know, it's almost as if they gave JD Vance the Twitter account and he's running it. I say that because he's a bit of a flame lord. He's an elder millennial. You know, he likes to be very, very sassy online. He was calling Mehdi-Hassan a dummy last week on Twitter, which is kind of the kind of communication you just don't expect from a vice president and a president.
Just to briefly interrupt you, I think at CPAC he said that his wife had told him to be nicer on social media. Yes.
She seems like a lovely woman, and I bet she has told him that. You know, I do find this to be crude. I would not say that they can't post videos of deportations. The voters clearly have asked for this. This is what Donald Trump was elected to do. And I'm not for concealing the ugliness of policy. So there's a certain element here where I want people to understand when you vote for something, such as deportations, this is what it looks like. This involves shackles, chains, the police shuffle up a flight of stairs into a plane, and you're gone. But I think it is this added layer of sort of glorifying it and saying it should give you a little tingling feeling up your spine. You know, that rubs me the wrong way.
Well, that's the thing. You see, I agree with your statement that it is wrong to conceal the ugliness of policy or the ugliness of anything in the political realm. But the problem here is exactly that the White House is presenting an ugly reality as if it is something to take joy or pleasure or enjoyment from. And I think that points to an inversion of what would be the normal moral compass. You say the people asked for it. The people certainly asked for more restrictionist policies when it came to immigration. It was one of President Trump's strongest
Such as
issues.
The very popular
in the thing.
position for mass deportations, which has risen so steeply in the past decade.
But the point about this video is, it is, I think, indisputably dehumanizing of people, indisputably taking glee at the treating people in that way or putting people in chains in a way that I just think debases the underlying debate. And I think that that is an argument that can be made specifically about Trump, but about our political culture generally over, I mean, I've lived here for 20 years, more than 20 years now. And even within that period of time, the degree to which political discourse in the United States has grown cruder, has grown more demagogic, has grown more willing to sort of take delight in people's suffering, I find very, very distasteful.
So again, I'm really with you on that top line sentiment that encouraging the nation to take delight in these things is this layer of it that I really dislike and I find to be crude. But when it comes to the individuals in that video being shackled up, put on this plane, I think this was a Venezuelan deportation.
I'm not sure, honestly.
I believe that is the case. My sympathies are reserved for the people who are harmed by illegal aliens who come into this country. For the 15-year-old girl in Massachusetts who was raped and brutalized by Corey Alvarez before being arrested and then released on $500 back into the public only to be detained again. The guy has to go back to Haiti, right? This has to be done. This has to happen, and we should care about the fates and fortunes of Americans first and foremost who are being harmed by criminal aliens who are coming into this country with zero accountability. I reserve my sympathies for those people, But I agree, we should not be encouraging the public to just turn off any sort of feeling that they have about this imagery. I'll give you that.
So on the point of people illegally in this country who have committed further criminal acts, sometimes heinous criminal acts, those people should obviously be deported. I have never argued otherwise. I think that I think that it is ludicrous that people who have committed very serious crimes and are illegal immigrants should remain in this country. I don't believe in that at all. But the point about that video is we don't, and in fact, the point about the broader White House data recently is that there isn't really even all that much detail about whether the people being deported have committed any kind of criminal acts at all. And certainly there was no context provided in that clip that we showed. So to me, that clip isn't really, with all due respect, about making your point about people who've committed violent acts or sometimes murderous acts. It's about saying we're locking up or chaining up these people and sending them back. Isn't that great? You know, 3 cheers for that. And I just think that is dehumanizing by its nature.
Yeah, no, I think that there's something to be said for that. And the broader imagery is important for people to understand that this is what you voted for, this is what you get. But I'm with you. The White House should be more careful and tactful with how they encourage the best or the worst of Americans' impulses. I say they should be deporting every single person who came in at least the last 4 years without any papers or authorization. But there is a big degree of difference between doing that, doing it quickly, discreetly, quietly, and with some degree of respect for the people involved, and then making a show out of it on Twitter and calling it, you know, sensory, you know, something to delight in, ASMR. Yeah.
Well, we'll leave that there, obviously a hot topic, and a lot more topics to talk about on Rising right after this. Vice President JD Vance has a special message for men. Here he is relaying it at day 1 of the Conservative Political Action Conference in Washington yesterday.
I think that our culture sends a message to young men that you should suppress every masculine urge. You should try to cast aside your family. You should try to suppress what makes you a young man in the first place. And I think that my message to young men is don't allow this broken culture to send you a message that you're a bad person because you're a man, because you like to tell a joke, because you like to have a beer with your friends, or because you're competitive.
This discourse, much of it online, comes amid an ongoing larger conversation about what it means to be a man.
Conservative commentator Brett Cooper sat down with former Navy SEAL Sean Ryan, popular YouTuber, this week to discuss that exact question.
We kind of have this new caricature of men, and obviously I think that it is a response to the softening of men in our society, obviously, and what people are experiencing, but it feels now we've been pushed in the opposite direction, where men are now these caricatures of you can't cry, you can't love a woman, you can't get married, you know, being a father's gay.
I think being a man, I mean, if you're not trying to better society, then what the are you doing? It takes being vulnerable. It takes raising kids, and it takes, you know, monogamous relationships to better society. Every man's got to get, you know, a certain amount of mischief out of their system to become like the man that they're supposed to be. But if you haven't left a mark on society, you know, whether it's your kids or your wife or whoever, your nieces and nephews, what have you done here?
The number of young male voters who voted for Donald Trump and Vance reveal that many have shifted right. This week, journalist Derek Thompson wrote about a phenomenon about what he calls Generation C. And he wrote, "These are the young people whose experiences with COVID's health, political, and economic crises caused a strong shift among young people." He continued, "The pandemic increased alone time, sending young men and women in highly gendered social media spaces, where the youngest men in particular seem to have become significantly more anti-feminist and open to right-wing influencers and parties."
Author Richard Reeves, who wrote the book Of Boys and Men, is an outspoken advocate for improving the lives of those boys and men without hindering women.
Reeves believes boys and men are struggling in today's world and says toxic masculinity is a counterproductive term. He writes in his book, very few boys and men are likely to react well to the idea that there is something toxic inside them that needs to be exercised.
Reeves addressed the male voter in an op-ed this summer in the Wall Street Journal. He wrote, "The 2024 vote was set to be a referendum on the rights of women. Instead, it has become a debate over the needs and desires of men. The question now is which model of manhood will win in November. The macho brawler of the Trump-Vance ticket, or the kindly girl dad offered by Harris and Walz, the fighter or the coach." Now, we all know the answer to how that turned out, but look, Stephen, this is obviously a huge topic. I will have plenty to say about it. What's your initial thoughts?
Well, I think let's start at the beginning. You know, one of the first things that JD Vance said was that there's sort of this encouragement in the culture for men to suppress their masculine urges. And, you know, everyone in the CPAC room kind of nods along, goes, oh, yeah, suppressing masculine urges. What does that mean? You know, what are we talking about here? And I think I could guess what sort of the scions of the Me Too movement, because of what that was all about, right? And also kind of just boilerplate feminists think male urges are. It tends to be domination, harm of others, sexual violence, or just raw sexual appetite, stuff like that. And I would say that JD Vance, his perspective is that the masculine urges are more about leading others, sort of being that large presence in a room, building things, and also destroying them. You know, the kid playing with Legos who just really wants to knock the whole city down and then put it back together again. I think there's this attitude there that boy is going to be scolded by the overprotective mom, the helicopter parent, or the female teacher in the classroom and go, why don't we not destroy things instead of building them? Well, boys are good at both, and they need to be directed in that way. So what did you take on masculine urges?
So the point that I found about masculine urges, or well, of what JD Vance said about masculine urges, is, you know, his argument is the culture is hostile to them. And is the culture really hostile to them? The most watched TV event of every year is the Super Bowl. The most popular music genre in America is hip-hop. The most popular podcast in America, at least until last week, is Joe Rogan. Do those elements of huge touchstones in American culture suggest that people should suppress masculine urges? Quite the reverse, I would say. So I worry at some level that there's a backlash against equality, really. But let me just. I was glad actually to see.
Hold on though. But
okay. Well,
I'll get. Let's take a cultural slogan. The
Yeah.
future is female. All right. So this is something that kind of goes around in entertainment circles a lot. And this went viral when Kathleen Kennedy, who runs Star Wars and Lucasfilm, wore this T-shirt. It says, "The future is female." It spawned a bunch of articles and analysis, and people picked up this slogan in the political space too. Harvard held a symposium about the future being female, women in elected office. What does that mean? The future is female. Is that some sort of positive message? If the future is, where are the men?
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about here, and I think that's what JD Vance is responding to. Why do we have these slogans that are unnecessarily divisive and is speaking almost as if we're doing replacement?
Well, to the point about unnecessary divisiveness and how we overcome it, I was actually quite impressed in the clip that we played to see the two, I presume, conservative figures talking about the dangers of a limited view of masculinity. Because this is something I'm going to have to sort of beg your indulgence in a sense to talk a little bit sort of in, not exactly in personal terms, but I think this is such an important issue to get into because, look, I mean, I'm a 50-year-old man. I hope I've learned some lessons along the way. And one of the lessons, I would argue, is authentic masculinity emanates from feeling comfortable in one's own skin.
Agreed.
And that can take various shapes. What I see online a lot, particularly with younger men, is a very obvious discomfort in their own skin sometimes. And I don't want to be uncompassionate to those men themselves. But what I worry about is they are being sold a sort of caricature of masculinity, sometimes literally sold it for profit by some of the worst people in the world, honestly.
The room is Andrew Tate.
The Andrew Tates of the world, the Conor McGregors of the world, to note my Irish heritage briefly. But a kind of caricature that is sold as, I think, strong and brave and dominant, and anyone with any measure of emotional maturity really recognizes it as an expression of insecurity or anxiety, sometimes of fear. And I not to go on at too much length, but I honestly worry that young men are being sold a version of masculinity that is kind of a recipe for unhappiness, because, and I'm speaking particularly of heterosexual young men here, there is a version that is very suspicious of women, very suspicious of female independence, very suspicious of female sexuality, and is so sort of cartoonishly masculine that I think it leaves no room for real connection, real intimacy, tenderness, actually. And I think that those are real problems.
Brett Cooper is formerly of the Daily Wire, and she had on Sean Ryan, who's the third biggest podcaster in the world. He doesn't get as much coverage as Joe Rogan does, but this is a guy who served in the SEALs, experienced military man, and he's talking in that interview about masculinity as control, mastery of self, knowing who you are, and also building things, monogamous relationships, having kids, and leading others. And then he turns in that interview and also then talks about crying, right? So this is the famous, boys should cry, and that's good. And he agrees. In general, guys need to be able to open up and share who they are and what they care about. And there's this subtone there about men need to be able to fight and defend things. And to defend things, they have to know what is good. They have to know what they're fighting for. So it's sort of like this cartoon of, the man who's fighting back against industrialization and destroying, beautiful landscapes. You'd cry over the knocking down of a tree. A little tear trickles down your cheek because something beautiful was destroyed. Men need encouragement to actually get involved in the game of civilization building, fighting back against something that is bad. Otherwise, men's urges are turned inward. They destroy themselves and they destroy people around them. When they are not given sort of that command by society to do great things. The message of Walls and Kamala was, it's okay to sit back seat and applaud for your wife. And it is. It is. Okay. You should be a supportive husband. But that's not inspiring to boys. They want to be told to go out and slay a dragon. That's why Jordan Peterson is so gosh darn popular.
I mean, maybe. I think that there just has to be a care about not creating such a rigid framework for masculinity that it in fact exacerbates the problems that we're talking about. Makes people more alienated, more angry, more, to use your terminology, within themselves.
You're so right, and we don't want that. And I think one of the ways that you get there, and Richard Reeves talks about this in his models for education reform, we need more male teachers. There have got to be more men in the classroom because boys need mentors. They need men to guide them, to show them how to be men. And what you have in the culture, and again, I think this comes from Hollywood and from the Democratic establishment, is women are going to tell you how to be a man. And there's a realm for that, particularly in romantic relationships, but boys need to be shown the way by men. And that starts in the classroom. And that also, unfortunately, begins in the social media realm when they're looking for guys who are telling them how to make it through this life. So you don't want it to be one thing or the other, and we need to do better in our education system, even if that means holding boys back a year to emotionally mature, which Richard Reeves has also suggested. We don't have a system that recognizes the differences between boys and girls and how stark they are. We just sort of expect them all to fit in one mold, behave, sit down in class, and do whatever the predominantly female teachers say. What if we had a system that celebrated boys' natural inclinations, held them back a year so they can stop being so obnoxious as they tend to be, and then succeed better in life?
Sure. Well, So much we could say about that, but we will leave it there for the moment. Coming up, who is Peter Marocco and why should you care? That's next. Now we're going to discuss one person who pushed for the dismantling of USAID. Peter Marocco, he was a former high-level State Department official in the first Trump administration and then had a senior post at USAID. There, according to ProPublica, he, quote, attempted to delay or halt dozens of programs, including those that benefited Bosnia and Herzegovina's unified government, and reinvent the agency to better align with his version of US foreign policy. That agenda, former colleagues told ProPublica, was overtly militaristic and Christian nationalist. The complaints about Marocco alarmed agency leaders so much that they significantly curtailed his duties in the waning months of the administration.
Fast forward to 2025, and the USAID was one of the first targets on DOJ's hit list.
Here with us now is Anna Barry-Jester, co-author of the piece in question. Trump official destroying USAID met with Christian nationalists abroad in defiance of US policy. That's a long headline, but a great piece, and she will explain who Peter Marocco is, what he did, and the impact he has had. So welcome, Anna, and just sort of flesh out this part for us, particularly, I think, the reference that we made in the introduction to the kind of Christian nationalist elements within this person's record.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. So Peter Marocco is currently the Director of Foreign Assistance at the State Department. He has also delegated the power of the Deputy Administrator at USAID, and he is largely in charge of the dismantling of USAID that has been going on. According to multiple sources we spoke with, while he was on a trip to the Balkans in 2018, he secretly met with Bosnian Serb separatist leaders. According to sources, this was done without the knowledge or permission of the ambassador. And the important thing here is that some of these separatist leaders were under US sanction at the time for actively obstructing an agreement the US had helped to broker in the late 1990s to bring peace in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
What is your working definition of Christian nationalist as it pertains to Bosnian politics? And I ask that because it's sort of a boogeyman buzzword. It comes up in a couple of different debates in the US. What are you basing that off of, and what does it mean?
Right, this is a great question. So Bosnia has three significant populations. They have a Catholic Croat population, a Bosnian Christian Serb population, and a little over 50% of the country is Bosniak Muslim. There has been a lot of tension between these groups, and that led to a war in Bosnia in the 1990s. The United States helped broker a peace deal, but the Christian Serb wing of the government has talked often about separating and creating a new state or joining the Serbian state, and they have an overtly, Christian nationalist rhetoric and policy.
And just to be clear, Anna, what is his role now? I mean, we mentioned in the introduction him having some influence on the dismantling and the hollowing out of USAID. Could you just explain how that works, what his part in that is?
Yeah, I mean, we've been told that Peter Marocco is the most powerful person at the State Department right now. He drafted the initial memo that stopped all foreign aid. He has been instrumental in opening the doors to Doge and Elon Musk. He is actively involved in putting nearly all of the staff at USAID on leave and essentially stopping all foreign aid programs that are in the United States right now.
So, sorry, just to cut across my colleague here, but in relation to that point, so the argument essentially, or your thesis, is that this stuff that he did in Bosnia and in the Balkans was emblematic of a broader view that he has, which is militaristic and Christian nationalist in nature, and he's now enacting those kind of values in his current role.
Yeah, what former colleagues told us was that he had an agenda when he was at USAID that was overtly militaristic, was trying to convert aspects of USAID, which is supposed to be a soft power, foreign aid, humanitarian department into a much more overtly Christian nationalist, militaristic standpoint. They also said they felt like, he is, and this is in the words of former and current colleagues, that he has a campaign of retribution against people who blocked his earlier efforts. So while he attempted to do some of these things in the previous administration, they feel like he now has unfettered access to make whatever changes he wants to USAID.
I read your piece, and ProPublica's reporting is always fantastic and in-depth. And my takeaway from this was that everyone probably involved in politics in Bosnia are all post-Soviet communist thugs at their core. And I don't like Peter Marocco sort of liaising with these people in any way. I think that's generally bad. But it's framed as a break with U.S. policy. And I'd like to know whose policy is that, because Donald Trump served at the time, and he's brought this person back into a, like you said, the most powerful role in the State Department. So he clearly is not that displeased with him. It seems to me that Peter ran afoul of the sort of deep state types who served under Clinton, maybe John Kerry, and then Tillerson. What happened here?
Right. So we were not here to pass judgment on Bosnian politics in any way. What we understand, though, is that Morocco was doing things that were out of compliance with U.S. policy, including sanctions that the Trump administration had placed on Dodik, the president of the Bosnian Serb region within Bosnia, for actively obstructing this agreement that's called the Dayton Agreement that the U.S. Had helped to broker. And so, yes, there are longstanding policy, including through the first Trump administration, that these actions were not in compliance with.
Did you reach out to Morocco for the piece, and if so, did you get any response from him?
Yes, we have reached out repeatedly with questions for this piece and others, and have not received any response from Peter Marocco.
And in relation to where USAID stands right now, is your assumption, given that the views that you ascribe to him from your reading of his record, your assumption is that he would be pretty happy about the effective dismantling of USAID because it would comport with his overall worldview?
So there are multiple lawsuits filed against the Trump administration's actions with USAID, which has really largely dismantled this agency. It once had, almost 14,000 employees. The vast majority of them have been fired or placed on administrative leave, although the courts have intervened and temporarily stopped that broad use of administrative leave. The courts have also ordered that the administration restore several foreign aid projects, in particular those that predated the Trump administration. Morocco himself has filed declarations in these court cases saying that what the employees say is not true, that there are many people who've testified that they were in war zones and were suddenly cut off from their email and access to safety programs and protocols. He has said he doesn't believe that to be true. And additionally, he filed another declaration saying that even though the courts told the administration to reinstate programs and funding for foreign aid, he has said that they are not doing that. They're not going to do that. They believe they have the authority to continue to withhold that aid.
Anna Barry-Jester of ProPublica, we really appreciate you joining us on Rising.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Up next, a spat over who exactly should rescue astronauts stranded in space. Stay with us. Elon Musk at your rescue, or maybe not.
SpaceX founder Elon Musk and European Space Agency astronaut Andreas Mogensen got into a fiery back and forth online over the two stranded NASA astronauts.
The online spat came in response to a remark Elon Musk made during an interview with Fox News earlier this week. Let's take a look.
At the President's request or instruction, we are accelerating the return of the astronauts, which was postponed kind of to a ridiculous degree.
They got left in space.
They've been there. They were supposed to be there 8 days. They're there almost 300.
Biden.
They were yes, they were left up there for political reasons, which is not good.
Okay, it's not good. Now, if I had the weight of the pressure of doing that successfully on my shoulders, I think I'd be, but when we spoke before we did this interview, you are very confident. You think this will be a successful mission.
Well, we don't want to be complacent, but we have brought astronauts back from the space station many times before, and always with success. So as long as we're not complacent.
When are you going to launch?
I think it's about 4 weeks to bring them back.
About 4 weeks?
Yeah.
And
we're being extremely cautious. Yeah.
You now have the go-ahead.
Yes. Well, thanks to you.
They didn't have the go-ahead with Biden.
What's that?
He was going to leave him in space. I think he was going to leave him in space.
Well, it's like when we were growing up, lost in space.
Yeah, he didn't want the publicity. Can you believe it?
Mogensen in 2015 became the first Danish citizen to fly in space, and he reposted Musk's interview on X, writing, "What a lie," and from someone who complains about lack of honesty from the mainstream media.
To which Elon Musk responded, "You are fully retarded. SpaceX could have brought them back several months ago. I offered this directly to the Biden administration and they refused. Return was pushed back for political reasons, idiot."
Andreas Mogensen fired back, writing, "Elon, I have long admired you and what you have accomplished, especially at SpaceX and Tesla. You know as well as I do that Butch and Sonny are returning with Crew 9, as has been the plan since last September. Even now you're not sending up a rescue ship to bring them home. They are returning on the Dragon capsule that has been on ISS since last September."
Spicy.
It is spicy. I wish Elon Musk wouldn't use that word to anybody. It's just, I thought we were past using that word, and anyway, it is. He did, so there we are.
I think I didn't know much about this until diving in and just sort of reading up on this story and researching, but like 8 to 300 days is a big gap. And the astronauts, like Mogensen mentioned, have been pretty upbeat about this. They have said in interviews with CNN, "We are not stranded." I have the quote here because I think it's really important. They said, "We don't feel abandoned. We don't feel stuck. We don't feel stranded. It was a little bit longer of a stay than we expected, but both of us are trained to live and work on this space station." And that sounds to me like astronauts doing their duty, being positive and not complaining, right? They're not going to go on CNN and go, "We were abandoned for political reasons." They're going to do it kind of like military officers would and say, "We're doing our duty."
But
I think that's right.
But is there any evidence that they were abandoned for political reasons? I mean, for Trump to sort of say, well, Biden left them up there as if Biden has some vested interest in leaving astronauts on the International Space Station seems curious to me.
Yeah, I thought that this was curious because he really needs to say what he means. Because you have to look into this and sort of make your own assumptions. But here's the thing. The Biden DOJ was suing Elon Musk's SpaceX for discrimination for not hiring asylees and migrants into SpaceX. They were under a federal lawsuit. The Biden White House could not cooperate or work with SpaceX for something like a rescue mission or bringing people back from the space station at the same time that they were taking them to federal court. Incredibly bad optics, incredibly bad politics, and it makes Biden look foolish. I would think that's what he's referring to.
But does it make Biden look foolish if that is a regulation or a practice that you can't employ, in this case, SpaceX for that function at the time that kind of case is going on? It appears from what the Danish guy says that the astronauts are going to get down in due course, and that the Biden administration, from what you say, is upholding a rule that you can't do both things. You can't employ the company that you're also investigating at the time.
I think that that's exactly right. And I don't know what the Danish astronaut knows besides having experience in that realm, and I respect his expertise. But what Elon Musk is, I think, teasing here, and it's something that he just needs to show us more about what he experienced, that he reached out to the Biden White House and offered to help, and they declined and opted instead to keep them on there until NASA could orchestrate its own return home for them. And they work on a much slower timeline. They are not like SpaceX in terms of caliber. And you could use the word stranded, you could use the word abandoned, you could use the word delayed.
But the astronauts don't use those words about themselves, which is where I'm getting pausing.
They're servicemen. I think that it's really important to look at how tactful they were when they've been speaking to media. We don't feel abandoned or stranded. They're making the best of it. They literally say, we're turning this into a positive. They don't want to be there. They wanted to be home 250 days ago, but they're not. Why?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know either. The details of this case are sort of lost in the murk of exactly what was done. Elon Musk makes this claim about political interference. You referenced what that could be a reference to, which I don't personally think is as damning as Elon Musk is making it appear in that interview. He has a propensity, as we know in Doge, to make claims that are not verified at all sometimes, or wrong sometimes. There was the thing just a few days ago about the 8 billion saving that turned out to be an 8 million saving. So I think not only me, but lots of people are skeptical of kind of claims that he makes.
I am always a little skeptical of claims that he makes too. He's very cavalier. But at the end of the day, you have two different administrations, one who is very eager to hold up Elon Musk as a hero, someone who is guiding civilization in a better direction, is brave, and then the Biden administration, who very much were opposed to Elon Musk personally and politically. They intertangled the DOJ with X, and there was all this political pressure towards Elon Musk because he was getting involved in politics. And for the Biden administration to give him an opening to do something heroic and bring astronauts back wouldn't have been part of that goal. And I think that's worth considering, that they might have kicked the can down the road here to not give him good headlines.
Well, I would just like proof of that. I mean, it's really as simple as that. You know, that's where the issue arises.
Proof.
Yeah, exactly. We want more proof. But in any event, maybe we'll get it. Maybe we won't. Stay tuned. That does it for us today on Rising. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.